Gone Girl is the story of Amy Dunn, a woman who mysteriously disappears from her home seemingly without a trace. Shortly after, a media circus ensues, and due to poor optics and a whole host of misinformation, the public is led to believe the worst of Amy's husband, Nick. This is actually a pretty common situation that arises with viral, unresolved true crime cases. The film starts from Nick's perspective. We follow along as he comes to the realization that he is not only the prime suspect in the eyes of the public, but also in the eyes of the actual investigators. The only greater context we get to Nick and Amy's relationship is given to us via flashbacks that are directly coinciding with diary entries that Amy had written. This diary ends up in the hands of the investigators on the case, and it leads them to believe that Nick is abusing his wife. This diary stands to validate the suspicions that they already have. But midway through the film, the perspective flips. We learn that everything that we have seen so far is not what it seems. It is all the result of a meticulously premeditated plan by Amy, designed to frame her husband for her disappearance and assumed murder. Why is she doing this? Because he had an affair, and Missouri has the death penalty. The critically acclaimed novel turned box office hit, Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn, examines themes of identity, deception, and your place in society through the lens of a dying marriage. When it was first released, the film acted as a revenge fantasy for many women who had felt second class to their somewhat negligent or disappointing partners. Meanwhile, it acted as a cautionary tale to many an absent-minded boyfriend or husband. It's a story where a woman evolves from a position of being an afterthought to suddenly holding all of the cards. She's able to violently assert her dominance privately while still publicly maintaining her socially accepted role as a demure, loving, graceful wife to a husband who routinely falls short, but hey, at least he's trying. She loves him. She's gentle yet resilient. She's doting and always graceful. She's forgiving and she's maybe not unconditionally loving. Nick's wife, Amy, she could either be a dream or a nightmare. It all depended on if Nick was willing to play along. It comes as no surprise that this would be an incredibly popular book and film, because if you're not happy in your relationship, this can be an incredibly appealing premise. In the book, Amy Dunn is an incredibly intelligent and disciplined woman, and her methodical patience is what allows her, ultimately, to get away with her many crimes, thus making her childhood nickname of Amazing Amy actually very fitting. Unfortunately, this tale would also act as a true life inspiration to one California woman. And if our fictional Gone Girl is Amazing Amy, then our real Gone Girl is more of a simple Sherri. This is the story of how Sherri Papini leveraged her position in society, knowing the frenzy that happens in the media when a conventionally attractive, white, blonde hair, blue-eyed mother with a loving husband is the victim of a potentially violent crime. She uses those optics in her favor to trick the entire country into not only searching for her, but then into rallying behind her when she manages to escape, only for it to then come out that not only has she been lying the whole time, but the person who everybody thought she was a lie too. Hi guys, welcome back to Spooky Saturday. I'm sorry I don't have the Morticia wig on, but I have to go to something after this and I didn't want to like dye my eyebrows black and then I have to like undo it. Thank you guys so much for your patience. I know I didn't upload one last week, but I promise it's because I was not only researching this, but I was researching like the next 5. So the upload schedule is gonna be very consistent henceforth, and the amount of work that I had to do for this video in particular, I'm very excited. I hope that you guys had wonderful holidays. Now let's get into it. I want to start with the good parts of Sherri, or at least the seemingly good parts of her.
Start with the fairy tale early days. Those are true, and they're crucial.
Sherri first met her husband Keith in just 7th grade. They were childhood sweethearts. And when they first met, they immediately liked each other. They used to write each other love letters, and they were actually each other's very first kiss. But when Sherri went off to high school, she ended up leaving Redding, California, and they lost contact. In high school, she was very type A.
Type A? Well, that can make you crazy if you're not like that. You seem pretty laid back. Type B.
She always got really good grades. She was doing well on the volleyball team. She was generally pretty well liked, and she had also developed a taste for beer. So we get the impression that she was a little bit of a partier, but it didn't negatively affect her academic performance or her extracurriculars. As far as the volleyball stuff, there's actually a lot more to all of that, but we'll get to that later. Shortly after high school in 2006, Sherri would marry David Dreyfus, her first husband. He was a platoon sergeant. It seemed like they ended on amicable terms, but the marriage was pretty short, only 2 years. She had ended up moving back to Redding, California. She got back together with Keith. They reconnected all this time later, found that they were still in love, got engaged, got married, and I guess you could say they were hashtag relationship goals because they had a relationship blog as well as a joint Facebook account. In 2016, Keith and Sherri had a pretty well-established daily routine. Sherri was methodical in her approach to life. She was super type A. She always did the same things every single day, and she was incredibly predictable, especially when it came to her morning routine. Her husband Keith would testify that she never deviated from her routine if she could help it. And November 2nd, 2016 was like any other day. Keith woke up, he got ready, and he headed to Best Buy for work. Sherri got up, she got ready, she made breakfast for the kids, and then she dropped them off at daycare. She comes home, she does some chores, and when she's about to go out for a run, because she was training for a Thanksgiving Day marathon, she texts her husband Keith asking if he was going to be home for lunch. Sherri goes out for her run, headphones on, phone in hand, but she never comes back. Keith comes home. As he pulls into the driveway, he notices that the house looks kind of dark, but he's not like immediately concerned. Maybe the kids just were really tired today and wanted to go to sleep early. He sees Sherri's cars in the driveway, so he knows everybody's got to be home by this point, and he just shrugs it off. He walks inside and, unlike usual, the kids don't run up to greet him, further confirming, okay, maybe they're just asleep. He starts walking through the house looking for Sherri, because at the very least, she always came to greet him, but she's nowhere to be seen. He knows her car's in the driveway, so she should be in the house, right? He peeks into the children's rooms, and this is when he starts to get really worried, because they're not there. He gives it a little bit. Maybe they just walked down to the mailbox or something. I'll give them a chance to come back. I'm sure it's fine. But after a while of nobody coming home, Keith decides he should probably call the daycare. He calls them up, and they inform him that his wife never picked his kids up. They're still there. At this point, Keith is really worried. This is not like Sherri at all. He takes out his phone, he checks Find My iPhone, and he sees she's just a mile up the road. Okay, I don't know what's going on. Maybe she's hurt, maybe she needs help, but I gotta go. He runs down to their mailbox, and Sherri's not there. He's looking around sort of in a panic, and that's when he sees it. Her phone and her headphones have been gently placed in the grass. He takes a picture, not wanting to disturb evidence, but then he picks it up and he calls 911. As Keith talks to the 911 operator, he goes from cool, calm, and relatively collected to thinly veiling extreme panic. The more he looks at the headphones, the more he starts to notice things. Some of Sherri's hair is caught in them. Does that mean somebody ripped them off? She would never just leave her phone like this. None of this makes sense. Oh God, I didn't see what she wore when she went out to run. I don't know what outfit to tell the police. I don't know how to help. The 911 operator tells him to return to his house just in case Sherri comes back while he's waiting for the police. She asks if there's anybody who can get his children so that he can stay at the house. Keith says yes, and he's gonna have his mom pick up the kids. The police arrive, Keith tells them everything that he knows, and a massive search ensues. It's irritating that this concept even exists, but there's really no other way to say it. Sherri was the ideal victim, really.
You need to package yourself so that people will truly mourn your loss. And America loves pregnant women. As if it's so hard to spread your legs.
She's thin, she's small, she's blonde, she has blue eyes, she's conventionally attractive, she's a mother to 2 young children, she's happily married. It seems like this is a case of somebody who was happy-go-lucky, who never made waves, never caused any problems, just stepped a mile out from their house and was taken. If that could happen to her, who else could that happen to? It could happen to me, it could happen to you, it could happen to anyone. But not only that, this all happened right before the holidays. This is in November. When people are thinking more than ever about spending time with family, this woman was suddenly ripped from hers. That's a nightmare. That is the nightmare. And while Sherri's family and husband were absolutely gutted and panicking, the police were feeling odd about the whole thing. The second they got to the scene, something was off. There were a few red flags that might not be obvious to somebody who doesn't work in law enforcement, but the investigative team noticed them right away. For example, why was Sherri's phone delicately placed in the grass with her headphones? That's something someone would do if they were gonna come back. Because if somebody is grabbed or attacked, either the victim themselves drops their phone, and so it wouldn't be delicately placed like that, or the perpetrator will take the phone and throw it or break it. It's just like there's really no violent scenario in which the phone would just be delicately sitting there like that. But the police were keeping these opinions to themselves at this point in time. They want to make sure that the family is compliant. They don't want anybody getting any wrong ideas about whether or not they're taking this investigation seriously. Especially because when the police asked if it was possible that Sherri could have just run away, her family was immediately very resistant. The cops knew that they would have to shelf that idea in front of them if they wanted to get anywhere. It's at this point that they decide to turn their focus on Keith. Because unfortunately, with most kidnapping cases, the perpetrator is usually their partner of whoever's missing. But Keith was almost immediately ruled out. Not only did he pass a polygraph with flying colors, but he had an alibi. So as November goes on, the cops basically have nothing. There have been no credible tips. There's no footage of Sherri. They really don't have any clues. Because of this, Keith is getting increasingly concerned. He doesn't want this to be a missing persons case that just flames up and then burns out really quickly. He wants to make sure that people don't forget about Sherri. He needs to make sure that his wife is returned. Keith starts doing as many media appearances as possible. He needs to make sure that his wife's name stays in the news cycle. But the more appearances Keith does, the more the public starts to turn on him. Keith said that Sherri ran at the same time every single day. But that was quickly disproven by other people in the neighborhood. Sherri's neighbors came out and said not only did she not run at the same time every day, she didn't run at all. In fact, she didn't seem to be a very fit person from what they could tell. Maybe she's working out inside, but no one ever saw her exercise outside. She wasn't biking, she wasn't walking, she wasn't running. Additionally, Keith said that Sherri was always with the kids, that she spent most of her time as a stay-at-home mom with them. Sherri did not have a job. She stayed at home full-time, and that's completely fine, but people didn't really understand why the kids were in daycare all day until right before Keith came home then. I mean, how could she be spending all of her time with the kids if she dropped the kids off right when he left for work and picked them up right before he came home? There were a lot of little inconsistencies like that that led people to believe either Keith does not know what his wife's daily routine is, or he's lying. And because there are so many cases of husbands killing their wives and trying to cover it up, the optics were just not in Keith's favor. Keith is well aware that his wife's case is going stale, so he decides to create a GoFundMe so he can hire 2 private investigators of his own. He makes sure to publicly say that he has no problems with how the police are conducting their investigation. He thinks they're all working really hard. He does not at all think they're incompetent or anything like that, but if he can have more people on the case, as her husband, it's his job to do whatever he can to help. And Keith's GoFundMe ends up generating $49,000. It's at this point that we're introduced to Cameron Gamble. Cameron Gamble is one of the craziest parts of this story, which is saying a lot. By the time you finish this video, there's going to be so many things at play here that you're going to be like, whoa. But Cameron Gamble, all that being said, is still like top 3 craziest things to happen in this case. Now, Cameron would never publicly admit this, but he is clearly a con artist. He comes forward and he introduces himself to Sherri's family, specifically to Keith, and he tells Keith that an anonymous multi-millionaire has retained him so that he can help him find his missing wife and ideally change this case from an abduction to a hostage negotiation. How is he going to do this? Well, according to Cameron, he is one of the best hostage negotiators in the world. According to Cameron, he has successfully negotiated the return of thousands of hostage victims. There is no evidence of this literally anywhere. You would think that one of the 1,000 people who Cameron helped would be willing to, like, I don't know, go to bat for him. Cameron also claims that, like, the multimillionaire who retained him just became hyper fixated with this case and wanted to do whatever he could to help, but he wants to remain anonymous. I'm like 99% sure there is no multimillionaire. Cameron just made this up as like a way to try and legitimize himself, like, this guy had to retain me for tons of money. That's how good I am. But he is not. In fact, Cameron's entire resume is a lie. According to Cameron, he was enlisted in the Air Force, which is actually true. That's the one true thing on his resume, although he completely misrepresents his time because he enlisted in 2002. He's discharged by 2005, right? He says that this 3-year stint in the Air Force is what qualifies him to be a hostage negotiator. It doesn't. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. He was a vehicle ops assistant. Basically, like, to take it out of military terms, layman's terms, he was a mechanic. He had no crossover with hostages or hostage situations at all. He claims that he took specialized training. He did not. He took the same introductory training as everybody else and nothing else. He actually claimed that he trained, not like trained with, like he was the trainer of the special forces. Why they would have somebody who was in the Air Force for 3 years train the special forces after they've only taken like introductory training, I don't know. Probably because that would never happen. The military has also come out and confirmed that he did not train the special forces and he did not take any sort of extra training beyond the same base level training everybody goes through. So he has been outed by the US military. And then after he left the Air Force, he created a bunch of like fraudulent businesses, or at the very least like very scammy businesses. And they almost all somehow capitalize on his like 3 years in the Air Force. So like the first one that he did was like Taken themed, like the movie Taken, where he claimed to be able to train people in self-defense so that they could avoid being kidnapped. The other thing that he tried to push, which is really audacious and weird, he tried to sell the police this program where he claimed that he was going to teach them interrogation methods so that they would no longer have to torture people. The police were like, yeah, we don't torture people that we bring in for questioning, and we already have interrogation programs in place. And also, assuming that the police can't access your resume and record and see that you were just like a vehicle ops assistant in the military and nothing else is pretty audacious. So like, obviously he didn't get any takers for any of these programs. And by 2012, he would go bankrupt. It seemed like he was definitely just trying to do whatever he could to profit off of like traumatic situations, I guess. So it comes as no surprise that Cameron would insert himself in Sherri's case. Very on brand for Cameron. A week after Sherri goes missing, he contacts Keith. He tells Keith that like not only has he been retained, but he's also been given an additional $50,000 to just sort of keep in his back pocket in the event that negotiations for release arise. And you know what I think about that number? I think it's really interesting that Keith's GoFundMe came out at $49,000 and that our boy Cameron Gamble is saying that he has $50,000, because I think in the event that things were to go the way Cameron thought they were, he was planning on just saying that his money transfer didn't come through and like, oh no, like we need to negotiate with them within the hour, otherwise they're gonna change their minds. Keith, just use that, use the GoFundMe money you've got. I'm almost certain that that's exactly what Cameron's contingency plan was, and that he was gonna be like, it's only $1,000 difference, like we'll just pull our own money together. I see it, Cameron. I'm almost certain that's exactly what he was gonna do. Even more than that, confusingly, despite the fact that like Cameron claims he's been retained, he tells Keith he's willing to work for free because he cares about this case so much. So is he working for free or has he been retained? That's my question. It's pretty obvious to me that Cameron's angle here is this is a very viral case. If he can successfully negotiate this thing, he's going to have a whole host of new clients. It's going to be great publicity. That's 100% what Cameron's getting out of this. And you might be wondering, though, given this lead up, I kind of doubt it. Was Cameron good at negotiating hostage situations? Well, luckily, we have some footage of Cameron negotiating this hostage situation with Sherri, or so he thinks. I'll let you be the judge. The context for this is that Cameron is assuming that whoever's kidnapped Sherri is following all of the media about the case, and so he thinks that he can just enter his content creation era and talk to him. And he goes about this in the worst way possible.
My name is Cameron Gamble, and I'm an international kidnap and ransom consultant. I've been retained by an individual who wishes to remain anonymous, an individual who has come forward to offer a cash reward for a ransom for Sherri Papini's return back to her family. I have looked at this case thoroughly. I've spoken to the husband, Keith, and I am 100% convinced this is an abduction case. This is not a kidnap for ransom. We are trying to turn it into that. I don't know your motive. I don't know who you are, where you're going, where you're from. I don't care. I simply care about getting Sherri back. Our objective is to reach out to you and have you take advantage of this one-time opportunity to take the cash for Sherri's return. This offer is off the table in less than 100 hours. We're not working with the FBI. We are not working with local law enforcement. We don't care about justice. We simply care about Sherri's safe return. 530-351-2748 is the number you can call on this phone, and we will work out the agreement to get Sherri back. It does not matter if it's night or day. It does not matter who you are. I simply care about getting Sherri back. Take advantage of this opportunity.
Now, I'm no expert, neither is Cameron, but it would seem to me that the kind of person who would just suddenly kidnap a woman on a jog is probably somebody who's exhibiting some attention-seeking behavior and at the very least has like some dark triad traits, might be a little narcissistic. So I think, personally, repeatedly saying the phrase, I don't care about you, I don't care what you want, I don't care what you do, is probably not the way to endear yourself to somebody with that personality archetype. That's just me. Again, I've never negotiated a hostage situation. I'm just assuming that the kind of person who kidnaps other people probably has a certain psychological profile, and I'm just not convinced that Cameron's approach is in line with that. You know who else wasn't convinced of that? The FBI and literally every investigator ever. Yeah, they immediately came out, they took to the media, they said, not only was Cameron's approach bad, but it was dangerous. If Sherri is actually being held by kidnappers who might have been considering a ransom as an out, they're certainly not going to now because his approach was so heavy-handed. But don't worry, if you liked that first clip from Cameron, there is in fact a part 2. So unsurprisingly, no one pays the ransom. And Cameron, now looking like a fool, he already did, but like, he thinks that now about himself, decides that he's got to upload a part 2. He comes out, TLDR, I'm going to show you guys obviously, but he comes out, he just threatens the perpetrators the entire time, basically. Takes a break in the middle to thank his fans through the lens of like, the multi-millionaire wants me to thank you guys for all the views and likes and comments. Sure, Cam.
Man, your life seems like a Harlequin nightmare, fool.
And then he goes back to just threatening them. And now, the same people who already weighed in like, you're gonna get Sherri killed, are losing their minds. Because like, if she's still alive at this point, she's gonna be dead now. You're threatening them. You're threatening an incredibly delicate situation. You're trying to make them feel like they have no out. Dude, they're gonna kill themselves and Sherri. This is a disaster. So everybody is saying that not only is it bad, not only is it negligent, but it's just super dangerous, which I agree with.
It is now 5 a.m. on November 23rd, and the ransom money for Sherri Papini is officially off the table for the individuals who abducted her. I'm sorry you didn't take advantage of this opportunity when you had the chance. I was your safest and your best option aside from just letting her go, which you can still do. As I stated in the media, The world has been looking for Sherri Papini, and now the world is going to be looking for you, whoever you are. That's not a threat. That's not something I even control. It's just a known fact when things are elevated to this level. I've said from the beginning that justice has not been mine to bring you. I was retained for one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to find a way for Sherri to come home. But now I want to talk to everybody else out there. Everybody watching this video and everyone listening. You know, the anonymous donor who came forward with the ransom money has been completely overwhelmed by how the media shared our unconventional approach to finding Sherri's abductors, and overwhelmed by the incredible response from the community. It was you, the community, that took this issue serious by viewing and sharing our video over 100,000 times in just a few days. Because of your efforts, we have no doubt that those who have Sherri saw our offer. So now what? What do? Well, there's an offer that's still on the table. The entire ransom money is going to be combined with the $50,000 reward that was previously posted for tips leading to Sherri's whereabouts. That's a six-figure reward, and it will be paid confidentially and in cash immediately if you help us to Sherri. No one will know who you are. No one's going to ask any questions. We don't care if you're a convicted felon, if you're a person with a warrant out for your arrest, or a drug addict. We don't care about your name or where you're from. No one will ask you any questions about your identity. And there are no cops involved. They've not been involved from the beginning with us. There are no strings attached to this cash offer. You lead us to Sherri, and we give you more cash than you can spend. The anonymous donor has already left the Reading area to be with his family for Thanksgiving, but he's made the funds readily accessible so that we can make an offer to the person who's willing to help us. We're not interested in leads from dreams or visions or people with special gifts. We only want to hear from the person who absolutely knows who took Sherri or where she is. I have no doubt that somebody other than the abductors knows who took Sherri. Whoever you are, do the right thing. Better your life by taking the cash, and better the Papini family's life by leading them to Sherri. You know, I can't tell you what's going to happen in the days ahead, but I do know that a family and a community are outraged by the situation. And when people unite for a greater good, they're unstoppable. One way or another, all the unknowns will be made known. And this family and this community will unite. And closure will be given.
After all of this, pretty much everybody's gotten hip to the fact that Cameron is a scammer. So he's now being interviewed not for the great work that he's trying to do to help Sherri, but because people are asking him directly about how he's clearly trying to profit off of a family's desperation and tragedy. And when confronted about clearly trying to profit off this family's desperation and tragedy, he says that he's not profiting at all because the anonymous multimillionaire only paid him a retainer of $1, and that he donated that $1 to St. Jude's. That to me is like the biggest like a red herring for the fact that he's such a liar. It's like, okay, it's already like unbelievable enough that someone would retain you for $1, you know, like at that point, wouldn't you just be working for free? Like, wouldn't you just do that? Like, why would they take the time to wire you $1? But on top of that, why would you take the time to then wire that $1 to a charity? He said on impulse, I'm sure, they only paid me $1. And then it factored into his head like, oh, well, I guess that's still technically profiting. And so I donated it. Whatever. Cameron's friends and family and wife are standing by him though, and his quote, steadfast resolve. I think that his wife is probably in on this scam, but who knows? Maybe she is just very naive. But you know what? Like I said, this story is full of twists and turns. After all of this, Sherri is released. No one saw it coming. It's a Thanksgiving miracle. On November 24th, 2016, before the sun comes up, Sherri is freed. How convenient! She claims that she was bound and chained in a vehicle with a bag over her head when suddenly she was just pushed out. She says it was the first time that she'd been outside in days. She starts running around, beginning to look for help. She sees a house, she runs up the driveway, and then she's like, looks kind of sketchy, changes her mind. She's got chains on her arms while all of this is happening. Runs to a church, bangs the door down, no one's in there. She's like, oh no, runs to a major highway, and is so desperate to get somebody to stop, she actually flings herself in front of a couple cars, which like could have been very deadly. And one of the women that she like flung herself in front of, she calls 911, like she passes her, swerves around her, goes down the road a little bit, calls 911. She's like, there is a woman who is like clearly distressed on the road. I don't know what's going on. She's got like chains on her arms. Another driver on the road, an 18-wheeler, calls and corroborates the same story. So the police get out there and they're like, oh my gosh, it's Sherri! I literally can't believe it! So obviously the first thing they do is the cops take Sherri to the hospital. So in the past few weeks that she had been gone, she had actually lost 15 pounds. And she was already a very petite woman to start, so at this point she's only 85 pounds. Her long blonde hair that she had been cut off really choppily. It's like all inconsistent layers. It's short now. The chains on her arms actually needed to be cut off in the hospital because like they couldn't get them off themselves. And she was wearing completely different clothes except for her underwear. That was like the only thing that she had worn the whole time since she had disappeared. And when they examined her underwear, they found that it actually had a John Doe's DNA on it. People are suspecting, okay, she was kidnapped, probably assaulted. And on top of all of this, her body is covered in bruises. And not only that, but the bruises are all in different stages of the healing process. So it is clear that she has been getting repeatedly beaten for days and days and days and days. It is such a gruesome scene being painted here that you would think it couldn't get worse, but it actually does. Because on top of all of that, Sherri had been branded. The police call Keith to let him know they had found his wife, and luckily he was actually already awake. He had gotten up really early and he was in the middle of shaving when they called. Keith gets to the hospital, they have their moment, he's like crying, he can't believe that she's home, he's so relieved, it's incredible, but now it's time to get down to business. The police obviously need to talk to Sherri. They have to figure out what happened because the people who did this, they're still out there and they have to get as much information as they can as quickly as possible so that they can try and find them before they have the chance to flee. And when they start questioning Sherri, they notice that something's immediately off. She's really reluctant to speak to the police, which is pretty abnormal for somebody who is a victim of a very violent crime that the police are taking incredibly seriously and trying to solve. It's one thing if they weren't taking her seriously or thought that she was like lying, but at this point in time, they wanted to do everything that they could do to help her. But she is adamant that she does not want to talk to them, which saying you don't want to talk to the police is not enough. You have to actually not say anything beyond that, but she keeps saying things. So it's clear that she doesn't really understand how any of this works, but she's telling them she doesn't want to talk to them, that she had gotten the impression from her captors that law enforcement was involved. And then when she saw them taking notes on all of this, she got very upset because she's like, I said I didn't want to talk to you. You can't document anything I'm saying. Yes, I can. One thing that they had documented her saying was she said, and I quote, everyone thinks you ran away. And guess what? The buyer's a cop. They're never going to find you. Implying that this could potentially be some sort of human trafficking. But despite all this, the police would eventually get a story from Sherri. And this is that story. Sherri claims that she got up, she did her routine as they knew about, and when she went to go on her run, she saw a dark SUV pass her by. And shortly after passing her, it stopped, it reversed, and she heard two women asking if she could help them with something. She walked up to the window, and at this point, she sees a gun pointed in her face. They tell her, put the phone down and get in the car, thus explaining why her phone was so delicately placed in the grass. They told her, we don't want to kill you, but we will if we have to. When Sherri got in, they wrapped something around her head so that she couldn't see, tased her, and took her clothes off. And after all of this, Sherri claims that she started falling asleep. And so she didn't really remember anything from the car ride besides some sort of sewer smell. However, she was able to describe the two women in detail. She described two Hispanic women, one older, one younger. She said the older one was much meaner. The younger one seemed sort of reluctant, like she didn't want to be there, or at the very least, she was really inexperienced and anxious about this whole thing. Though the lower half of both of their faces had been concealed, she was able to describe in detail their upper nose, their eyes, their eyebrows, their hair, etc. She said that they were keeping her in some sort of house and they kept her mainly in the closet, and that there was a pole in the closet that she was chained to. This is a strange little detail here. She said that the chain was long enough that she could move about the closet a little bit, and so in her spare time she would do yoga and Pilates. Personally, if I was being underfed and going through a trauma, I don't think I would be doing yoga and Pilates, just because I'd be wanting to conserve my strength. I wouldn't want to burn any extra calories, so I'm certain that was a red flag to law enforcement. She said that the women also gave her a bucket to defecate in, and when she had asked if they could replace it with a kitty litter, they were compliant and did so. She also said that she tried to barter with them, offering to cook and clean in exchange for information about where she was, what was happening, or at the very least details on the buying process, who was going to buy her, where she was going to go. They obviously said no, and they mainly just spoke in Spanish in front of her. They did not want to speak to her in detail at all. She also said that they played really loud Spanish music in the background almost the entire time. A couple really specific details as well. She said the house was super cold all the time, and so they almost always had a fire going at nighttime. According to Sherri, there was no SA, no R word or anything like that, but there was a lot of physical abuse, and she claimed that she was regularly hit by the older of the two women. She said that she almost escaped once, but she doesn't give details about how she got out of the closet or anything like that, how she got unchained from the pole in order to almost escape. But she said that she almost escaped once. She made it all the way outside, but she was dragged back, beaten, and tied to a table. And at this point, that's when she received the brand. She said that the older woman, who was the one branding her, said the buyer likes for his girls to be branded. As for how she was able to ultimately escape after all of this, Sherri said despite the fact that they mainly spoke in Spanish, there were a couple words that she either understood or they said in English that led her to believe that the younger of the two women was worried about how much weight Sherri was losing, and she thought that she was sick and that she needed some sort of medicine because she was worried she was going to die. The older woman didn't want to give Sherri any medicine or anything like that, and so they were fighting about that. Sherri claims that through the closet she heard arguing, a gun go off, and then Sherri passed out. When she woke up, she was in the van again with a bag over her head, and the younger of the two women was yelling at her to get out before eventually just pushing her out of the car. Now, when you're giving the police your story of what happened, they ask questions. They either ask for you to elaborate on certain details, they ask things that maybe you forgot to mention or didn't cover, things that they had been worried about in their investigation that maybe you aren't taking into account, or if they notice any inconsistencies, they'll ask you to explain. Because a lot of times, you're telling this really terrible thing, you might be a little flustered and you might get confused at one point and need to correct something for the record. So they asked her about the male DNA in her underwear, because they had been assuming this was a case that involved R word, and she had just said explicitly it didn't involve that unprovoked. And she was unable to explain that. She was basically just like, oh, I don't know. And they were like, that's weird, because in her story, no men are even present. They also asked her about her hair. If they're gonna human traffic you, why'd they do that to your hair? I felt like that was kind of weird, and she couldn't really give an explanation for that either. Other thing is, whenever you're reporting a crime, you have to tell your story so many times. Not just because they want to make sure you're telling the truth, but just because you have to keep reiterating it to all of the different people involved. You have to reiterate it to a plethora of different investigators. You have to go talk to the DA about it. You have to go talk to your attorney about it. No matter what you're reporting, you just end up having to repeat yourself over and over and over and over again. And that's partly by design, because with Sherri, at least, while she was doing that, she would change little things, which isn't the most abnormal thing, I guess, but the little things that she would choose to change would be seemingly on paper relatively small, but they would have much greater implications. They would be key little details. So she was constantly morphing her story in small yet significant ways. And even though the police knew something smelled fishy, they wouldn't be able to prove it for 6 years. On March 3rd of 2022, Sherri would be arrested for not only fraud, but for faking her kidnapping. But before we get into what actually happened what Sherri was actually doing when she was allegedly kidnapped, let me give you a little bit more insight into who Sherri actually is. Now, originally, when all of this was popping off, people didn't have a very strong grasp on Sherri's early life. Because, I mean, when you love somebody and they're missing, there are sort of tropes and motifs of the kind of things that people say. She was beloved by all. She was always so selfless. She was so wonderful. She didn't have an enemy in the world. She was so kind. She was so sweet. We miss her so much. Those can all be true of victims. And in fact, a lot of times they are true of the victims. But in this case, they were decidedly false. She didn't have an enemy in the world. Sherri had a lot of enemies. She was always so kind and gentle. Sherri routinely got into fights. She would never hurt a fly. Sherri had a pretty extensive rap sheet, actually. She was always so generous. Sherri was a thief and a scammer. She was a loving and doting wife. Sherri's first marriage was a fraud, and her second marriage was riddled with infidelity. So let's start early. Let's get into it. Obviously, we know that Sherri met Keith in 7th grade. That's true. Then she transferred to high school and they lost touch. He doesn't really know what she was doing during that time, except for volleyball, of course. But we know a couple pretty key factors that definitely inform the events of this case. For example, it seems that Sherri had an ongoing feud with the Hispanic girls at her school. And I personally don't think it's a coincidence that her fake kidnappers she made up happen to be Hispanic women. Before anybody says that I'm just making unnecessary inflammatory connections, I have receipts. 2003, when Sherri was 21, so she had time to think on this. Time had certainly passed since high school. She could have come to a different conclusion in those years, and she didn't. She decided to post on skinheads.com. I don't know about you, but I personally don't really see a situation wherein anybody who isn't a white supremacist would be frequenting skinheads.com if they're not trolling. And this post takes place after high school, obviously, so I'm sure you're how does this connect to high school? Because the post is a short story that she wrote about her own life. Allegedly, the events in it are true. I think some of the events are probably definitely false, but she claims this is her reality. It's a really weird story where she claims that her and her dad were targets of the Hispanic kids and their parents at her school. She says that the reason they were targets is because they're of Germanic descent. She's claiming that people of color saw that she has blonde hair, blue eyes, and just decided she's a Nazi, unprovoked. She never said anything that could be potentially construed as racist before this. They just decided that she was racist. She claims that literally her dad was called a Nazi for being proud of her volleyball skills. She's painting it he was whoa, you're so good at volleyball. And that people were oh, what? Because she's the superior race? Is that what you're saying? Personally, I find that hard to believe. I don't think anyone would be saying that unless maybe he had made some sort of comments about how she's better than the other kids because of this or that. Maybe they would come to that conclusion then, but I don't see anybody looking at a proud dad and then being Nazi! Just don't see it. She claims that they actually went so far as to chuck ice at her dad, hit him in the back of the head when he was just watching her at a track meet proudly. He was just look at my daughter go. And then they were just bullying this man. She says that he turned around and he was hey, stop. And she was running and she was seeing all of this happen. Not very focused on the race, but focused on race, And she said that they even went so far as to fake salute Hitler behind him and stuff. And so that after she was done running, she went over there and she was hey guys, knock it off. And in her story, she's I even said a couple choice swear words, which I know... Sorry. Which I know skinheads wouldn't want me to act in a way that's not ladylike, but I just felt overwhelmed. So what's weird about this is she admits to supporting skinheads, but she gets semantically upset that like the kids at her school were calling her a skinhead, because she's like, that's ridiculous. Like, this is like a part of the fight, because she's like, that's ridiculous. I'm a woman and I have hair. I support skinheads. I'm not a skinhead. Which like seems like, who gives a shit? Seems like basically the same thing. Like, I'm on the side of the kids, you know? Even from like her skewed perspective of trying to paint herself as the victim, I'm still not on her side, you know? Anyway, she says that then when the kids won't stop saying that like her dad's a white supremacist, which like the context clues are leaning that way, she breaks one of the girls' noses. That's rational. She gets arrested, but they decide not to press charges, so she's let go. And her dad picks her up and he's like, I'm really proud of you, Cher. I'm really proud of you. I know your leg hurts, because like they messed up her leg during this whole altercation, because like according to her, 3 grown men had to pull her off because she was so jacked. Anyway, so she says her dad's like, I'm really proud of you, Cher. You did the right thing. Just keep on walking. Even though they messed up your leg, just keep on walking. Yeah, proud of you. Then she says that later, after all of this, even though they didn't press charges, she was jumped by 8 people, 3 guys, 5 girls, for being a skinhead, which like, again, like the argument ensues of like, I'm not a skinhead, I just support them. I would be if I were a man, of course. Semantics. Skinhead semantics. She says that they then took a 2x4, smashed her leg, and she single-handedly, despite all this, fought off 8 people successfully. Now, I'm not just not on Sherri's side because of like the obvious like racially motivated vibes in her skinhead.com post. But it's also clear that she's just a liar. Like, you did not fight off 3 grown men when you're breaking this girl's nose as like a small teenager. By the way, like, Sherri is like 4'11", okay? Then you did not fight off 8 people, one of whom had a 2x4. You did not fight off 8 people. You did not do that. Like, you did not do that. You did not do that. There's no world in which you did that. And then she wraps this whole thing up by being like, it just is really important to like be aware that these things, they happen. And like, no one can take your pride from you. Be proud. The whole post is whack. After Sherri first went missing, before she even got exposed for making all of this up and faking her kidnapping, the post went around because people were like, everyone is saying this wholesome white lady is missing, and while this white lady is missing, I'm not convinced that she's wholesome because look at this skinheads.com post. Both of her husbands made public statements. Her first husband, David, he came out and he was like, yeah, I knew about the post. Sherri told me about it while we were married, but she said that it was just bullies from her school. They posted it, pretending to be her, trying to make her look bad. Again, like, Sherri would have been like 21 when this happened, so why people from her high school would be cyberbullying her via skinheads.com without like amplifying it in any way for other people to see is beyond me and basically everybody else, but pop off. And he went on to say that it was just like a really cruel prank on their part, and she's the least racist person he knows. Either he does not know good people, or he's just delusional, because like there is no world wherein Sherri is the least racist person. Like on the spectrum, the least. Keith, her current husband, takes a completely different approach. He doesn't like actually touch on whether or not Sherri wrote that. He's just like, the post was just released to create a race war. I'm trying to find my missing wife. I don't care about this race war. Keith. Yikes, Keith. So that's like Sherri's history of like racism, but let's get into her rap sheet. It's extensive and crazy. I want to remind everybody that when the police initially asked Sherri's family, is it possible that she could be doing this for attention, or that she could have run away? Does she have a history of doing anything like that? Her family was really upset about the implication, and they were vehemently like, oh my God, no, are you not taking this seriously? I just want you to remember that that was their reaction before I read this criminal record to you. So let's start in the year 2000. Sherri's father files a report against her saying that she vandalized his home. Also in 2000, Sherri's sister calls in to report that she suspects that she tried to kick down her back door so that she could rob her house. Also in the year 2000, her father files a follow-up report after the initial vandalism, and he's like, I think Sherri actually burglarized my home. Now let's skip forward to 2003. So first, Sherri uses her father's card to withdraw an unknown amount of money without his consent. When the police talk to her, she's like, oh, my bad, I meant to grab his other card that I'm allowed to use. Must have grabbed the wrong one. And then he's like, there is no card she's allowed to use. Like, she can't grab any of them. Later in 2003, now this is where things get very interesting. There's a lot of strong parallels with Gone Girl and Amy Dunn's early life as well, shockingly. And this is where you really start to see some foreshadowing for Sherri's future. So 2003, her mom calls in. She says that her and her daughter had gotten into an argument, and now her daughter, which like you can hear stuff in the background, is beating herself, like hurting herself with different objects and things, saying that she is going to report it and blame it on her mother. So her mom's calling in. She's like, it's actively happening right now. I want it on record that like I am not hurting my daughter. I'm on the phone with you. I'm not hurting her. I'm literally on the phone with you right now. And she's saying that she's going to accuse me of doing something I did not do. I am not assaulting her. Please, somebody come out so we can like make things calm down a little bit, because I've been trying to like de-escalate and it's just making it escalate more. And like seemingly the more Sherri's mom tries to get her to calm down, the more she starts hurting herself. So this is the first example of Sherri falsifying abuse on her criminal record, but there's actually other testimonials of her doing similar things like this even before this, but we'll get into that. So these are all certainly bad things, but the first crime where she seems to drag somebody else into it was actually her first marriage. When she first went missing, people were trying to like establish a timeline for her life, and they were immediately like, things are like weird with her first marriage. Like, I don't know, like the timeline doesn't make sense. There's no record of them ever being in the same place even once. Sherri had already moved back home and met Keith, like reconnected with him, when she was like actively getting married for the first time. So the timeline suggests that Sherri and Keith were actually together for the entirety of her first marriage. And that's not just speculation, because actually her first marriage wasn't dissolved until after she was already engaged to Keith. So why did she let this go on for 2 years then if she was literally actively with somebody else the entire time? What is she getting out of this? What's the point? Well, people started to speculate that this was likely larceny, especially because they can't even provide one picture together or evidence they've ever been in the same place, yet they got married. So people were speculating like, okay, well, he gets military benefits. I bet she's getting some sort of like medical benefit as his spouse and like maybe a monthly stipend or something. Like, we don't know really what he's getting out of it, but like that's probably what she's getting. And David would eventually admit that it was larceny. That is literally people's guesses about like the monthly stipend and the benefits were literally completely correct. And what had happened was like they just had an agreement to get married. It was a fake marriage, and then they only dissolved the marriage when Sherri wanted to get actually married to somebody that she loved, and that's why David was so okay with it, because it was not an emotional relationship at all. Now that we know who Sherri actually is, let's get back to where we were before. March 3rd, 2002. Sherri has just been arrested. So right after she's arrested, especially because this case had been so viral when it originally broke and she was missing, the investigators decide to release the affidavit, which details like why she's being arrested and like the details of her many lies. But not only that, it goes through all of the details of her lives from her life and like her entire rap sheet. The fact that like her family was painting her in a way that wasn't accurate at all. And one thing that's especially notable is like Sherri in this affidavit had a history of running away and disappearing. So her parents being like, no, she would never do that, is whack. And I don't know why they said that. Like, I don't really get it. And people were basically rocked because like they had built up this like classic American girl image around her for like the last 6 years. And this affidavit just completely blew that up. It showed how completely wrong all of that was. And this isn't an instant of her just like deciding to make a bad choice for a month and like doing something crazy for the first time ever. Like, she's been crazy the whole time. And what's really interesting is like the reason this took so long was that the break in the case was 23andMe. So like they do this really cool thing now, and it's actually how they solved the Golden State Killer as well, where if your like aunt or your cousin or your dad or whatever puts their DNA into something like 23andMe, you can use that to find you, even if your DNA is not in the system. And so the male DNA from her clothes was flagged. They found this guy who had done 23andMe. He had 2 sons. One of those sons was Sherri's ex-boyfriend. Introducing James Race. So how did James get mixed up in all of this? So he was going through his house, he was doing spring cleaning, and he found some of Sherri's old stuff from high school. They dated back in high school. And he was like, oh God, it's been so long. I should just like send this back to her, honestly. She might want it as like mementos or whatever, but like I have no use for it. And so he sent it to her. She ended up reaching out and like was like, oh, thanks so much. And he was like, yeah, of course, like no problem. Like, you seem happy, good for you. And then she immediately is like, well, I'm actually not that happy. And she starts detailing all of the abuse from her husband Keith and how terrible her life is, and how like, despite the fact that they have this joint Facebook and like this relationship blog about how happy they are, she's never been more miserable in her life. And she says that he's routinely R-wording her. He's routinely abusing her. And like, brief aside, okay, as a survivor, there is no circumstance under which it is okay to lie about being R-worded, because it is so hard to get a conviction for an R-word case anyway. And muddying the water like that, even though less than 2% of reports are false reports, it just, it makes it so much harder for people who are actually trying to press charges. You are such a part of the problem. It is so unacceptable. It's so like diabolical to lie about something like that. Sorry. Okay, moving on. She essentially told him that she lived in fear of Keith and that she'd even reported it to the cops, but the cops were like, we don't care. We have no interest in helping you. And she was like, I've actually been putting money aside into a secret account so that I can run away from him. He has no idea. James seems to be a very nice, albeit kind of gullible guy. So he's hearing all of this and he's like, oh my God, that is terrible, Sherri. I can't believe that's happening. Is there any way that I can help you? And she's like, actually, yeah, like I'm gonna make a secret AOL account and we'll just talk to each other through that, because if Keith finds out that I'm talking to you, he might kill me. We have to be really careful about this. And he's like, oh my gosh, okay, yeah, like anything I can do to help, you know? And after talking through this like joint AOL account for a while, they agree that they're gonna buy burner phones to make this whole thing easier. This is like integral to Sherri's disappearance, by the way, the burner phones. So she asks James, and she's clearly been planning this out. So she asks James to ask one of his friends to rent a car under their name, so it's not under his name, let him use it, he drives down, he picks her up. She's gonna lie in the back so that she doesn't get caught on any of the highway cameras or anything for the entire drive back. And comically, the same lady who said that she was doing yoga and Pilates when chained in a closet, she also asks him to pick up some Starbucks for her on the way. Girl's kind of a walking stereotype, I hate to say it. She actually sends a care package with the details of where he's supposed to pick her up and stuff, so that there's like not a record. He drives by her mailbox. She's delicately placed her phone and headphones down because, again, she doesn't want to break her phone. She's gonna be coming back for it. The cops were right. So she places her phone down, he's driving by, and she just like jumps into the car and then stays lying down for over 8 hours, just like drinking her Starbucks on like the floor of this car. And when they get back to James's apartment, she's like, dude, I need you to board up all the windows. I don't want anybody to see me like accidentally at all. And he's like, okay, do you want to contact your parents or like your kids? Let them know that you're safe. You're just trying to get away from Keith. She's like, absolutely not. He's like, okay, your life, your trauma, we'll do whatever you want to do, you know? And according to James, as well as Sherri, this was not an intimate relationship at all. In fact, like he gave her his bedroom to sleep in and he slept on the couch while she was there, assuming that she's not going to be here for too long. She's going to crash for like a month or two, and then she's going to like use all the money in her secret account to like start her new life, get in contact with her parents and her kids and stuff, and she just needs like a moment to breathe. You know, he's trying to like let her process everything. She's been through a lot. But it wasn't long before James noticed that she was intentionally starving herself. Like he noticed it pretty quickly. There was one day where all she ate was half a banana and she wouldn't eat anything else. And he was like, dude, you're losing an insane amount of weight. Like, you've got to eat. And she was like, no, I can't. Like, it's just making my stomach sick. Then she starts hurting herself. He starts seeing that she's like hitting herself. He's like, I don't know if this is like a trauma response or what. She would even be like, James, I want you to hit me. He would be like, no, I'm not comfortable with that. He admitted that she did convince him a couple times to throw things at her. But that he was just not comfortable landing blows. He wasn't really sure what the point of any of this was, but he was just trying to like be supportive, I guess. It's also the one who branded her, but he said that he was sort of tricked into it, that basically from the moment she got there, she had been talking about wanting to get a brand, and she was describing it almost like the way one would describe wanting to get a tattoo. He said that she wanted like this specific emblem because it would signify her freedom and stuff, so he thought this was like a moment for her. He didn't realize that she was gonna like twist this into like some horrific abuse story. And essentially to the very end, he literally thought that he was helping her escape abuse from Keith until he saw her return to Keith and then do her little press run about how happy she is to be reunited with her family. She's escaped her kidnappers. And at this point, James, he knows that he's just been used, like he just got. But he's not gonna go to the police because he doesn't want them to think that he actually kidnapped her. So he's scared. He's like, as long as she doesn't bring me up, I'm not inserting myself. I don't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole. I do not want to be involved any further than I've already been involved. But when the police came knocking years later and they started asking him questions, like they didn't have to warm him up or anything. He was just like, oh, you want to know what actually happened with Sherri? Here's what happened. And he told them everything voluntarily, right off the bat, answered any questions that they had. And after looking over everything, there were no inconsistencies and there were no holes in his story. So they knew he was telling the truth, and that literally the only reason he didn't come forward before was because he was scared, and they were like, yeah, I feel like a lot of people would feel that way. But it still begs the question, whose DNA was in her underwear, because Sherri said it wasn't his and he said it wasn't his. So whose is it? Well, the affidavit also exposed that Sherri was a serial cheater. She had multiple men saved in her phone under female names so that if Keith were to look over her shoulder, it would just look like she was talking to one of her girlfriends. And there's 2 men that she would talk to that were specifically key in all of this, but their names were redacted. So I'm just gonna call them Man 1 and Man 2. Let's start with Man 1. So Man 1 was like an active sneaky link that Sherri had for years. Like they would spend weekends together, they would hook up, they lived in completely different states, but like they would just find ways to overlap their lives so that they could cheat together. And he actually was supposed to meet up with her the day that she disappeared, but he sustains that she stood him up and he just ended up getting back on a flight to Michigan at the end of the day because he was like, well, I literally just came here for this and you're not here. Man 2 is much more interesting to me though. Man 2 is less so somebody that she was cheating with, although there were like charged conversations and inappropriate conversations between them at a point. But Man 2 like does not ride for Sherri. Like he does not mess with Sherri. He's known her since they were young, actually.
She's a compulsive liar. She would, not talk to you for 3 or 4 days, and then all of a sudden there'd be some fantastical story about what happened.
Shaheen Davari says he dated the mom when she was a 20-year-old youth counselor. Get this, he says he was just 15.
In retrospect, sure, tons of red flags, right? That she was a counselor that was going out with a 15-year-old kid. I surfed all the time when I was 15, 16 years old. It's something that I really enjoyed doing, and she told me that she surfed as well. There was always an excuse as to why she couldn't go surf, and she had to have her surfboard that was at her house but didn't have any pictures.
He says there was also a mystery medical condition.
She was faking a heart condition at one point, and eventually, like, not only me, but a bunch of people figured out that that was not true.
What did you think when you heard that Sherri Papini was kidnapped?
I was like, there's no way. She's fine. I promise you she's fine. There's just no chance that she got kidnapped.
But he said that ultimately he was actually scared of Sherri. And he confirmed a lot of the stories that we already knew from her criminal record. He confirmed that she had tried to frame her parents for abuse, that she had admitted it back in high school in her teens. And she had also tried to frame other people at their school for abuse, including him. He said that she tried to frame him for R word, but it just didn't end up going anywhere. And it was because they had briefly dated, and then after he broke up with her, she was upset and she was trying to like get back at him, and she would later admit that that was the motive. Oh, and remember David, Sherri's ex-husband, who admitted that they were committing larceny together for medical insurance? He also said that Sherri tried to frame him after their divorce and told Keith that he had abused her and he had done all of these terrible things to her, and he only found that out later. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't have separated so amicably. So we have a woman who has a long history of running away as a teen, disappearing. Sometimes she even went to a different state to like hang out with boyfriends and stuff, and her family just didn't know where she was for like days and days and days. We have a girl who has a routine pattern of lying about being abused and just lying in general, being a compulsive liar, and a history of like racism towards the Hispanic community, who has now come out and said that she was kidnapped by Hispanic women who abused her. Very on brand for Sherri. After discovering all of this in 2020, the cops had brought Sherri in for questioning. This is before she was arrested. And they were basically giving her a chance to confess, and she's like not taking the bait. They decide to show her pics of fake perps, like, are these the women who kidnapped you? And she's like, no, like they don't look familiar. They show her a closet and they're like, we believe that this might be the closet that you were held in. Does it look familiar? And she's like, no, I don't think that's the right one. But then she gets even more suspicious because she's like, honestly, I don't want the women who kidnapped me to be arrested, because if it wasn't for the fact that they let me go, I wouldn't get to spend every day with my children. And the cops are like, okay, yeah, but you almost didn't get to spend a month with your children because they kidnapped you, and they could have killed you or sold you, and then you would have not, like, what kind of reasoning is that? And she goes on to say, like, I really don't think that these women that you're showing me, I don't think they should be arrested, even if they are the right women. And the cops go, we agree. And then they hit her with all of the evidence of all of her lies. Keith is sitting right next to her. Well, all of this is happening. She's getting exposed for the affairs. She's getting exposed for the fact that she was hiding at an ex-boyfriend's house. She's getting exposed for the fact that, like, she was not assaulted and there is some man's DNA in her underwear. She's getting exposed all over the place. She hyperfixates on the affair stuff, and she's like, no, like, I never cheated on Keith. I would never cheat on you, honey. And then the cops are like, okay, Keith, can you like leave the room for a second? And he's just like shook, and he's like, yeah. Right when Keith leaves, she's like, okay, like I did talk to them a little bit. But she refused to admit any sort of like inappropriate dynamic outside of her marriage, despite the hard evidence. And what's even crazier is like she not only refuses to admit the fact that she clearly faked her kidnapping, but her family is also standing by her. Like her parents, who know that she does stuff like this, are also maintaining that she's innocent. I don't know if it's because like the family rep is on the line or what, but like they are not, like they're like, she's innocent, she's not guilty. Bruh. She framed you guys too, like why? But at the end of the day, her legal team obviously told her that approach is not gonna fly, and she ended up pleading guilty. Because she was. She pled guilty not only for faking her kidnapping, but she also pled guilty for lying about it to the FBI. And she was ultimately sentenced to 18 months in prison, which I feel like is not really enough for like all of the resources she wasted, honestly, and the fact that like other people go missing every day and the media was distracted going on a wild goose chase for a woman who just wanted some attention and to like victimize herself. And the most recent update I have on her actually is as of August 26, 2023, she was moved from federal prison to community confinement, presumably for like good behavior, or maybe it's just overpopulated. And for the sake of closure, I also want to give a little update on Cameron Gamble. First of all, how crazy is it that like a moth to a flame, a scammer who is trying to like fake that he negotiates hostage situations is drawn to a case of a scammer faking getting kidnapped. Completely unrelated to one another. Like the universe just brought them together. How crazy is that? Like, what are the odds? But his wife and his kids are standing by him to this day. They've made a public statement. His wife is like, literally came out and said like, I really love that my husband has such strong convictions. That's what she said. Like, okay. I feel like she's in on the scam personally, but maybe she's just really gullible. I don't know. And like after it came out that Sherri, who he had routinely said is like clearly been abducted, when it came out that Sherri was not abducted at all, Cameron Gamble made a public statement where he was just like, I will comply with the court's decisions as far as Sherri's case. I agree that if she did everything that they're saying that she did, then she deserves that sentence. And I even went so far as to tell the FBI so. Dude cannot help but like his like false sense of his like ego is crazy. Like he needed to insert in there like, and I told the FBI my opinion. Like the FBI cares what Cameron Gamble thinks. And he's just like, I believed that I was helping someone in need, and I told my children that doing what you think is right is never a waste of time. And I mean, that last part I agree with Cameron. What's crazy is Cameron did not get in trouble for any of this. Like Sherri got in the end. But Cameron, I mean, other than like him just filing for bankruptcy in 2012, like he has seemingly faced like no real repercussions for his involvement in any of this beyond people just like hating him, which is like kind of crazy. Now to close out, I just want to touch on the parallels between Amy Dunn and Sherri, because it is kind of incredible, especially with the early life stuff. Gillian Flynn wrote a fictional character who seemingly happened to share a lot of similar early life milestones as this real person who would go on to do the same thing, which is just kind of crazy. I don't know if this is a situation of life imitating art or art imitating life. It's just, it's so odd. From like the archetype of person that they are to like their early life and their relationship with their parents, it's just like so wild. Both Amy and Sherri's marriages have this like romantic sort of fanciful intro to them, where it's like Amy and Nick are essentially like love at first sight in New York City, and Sherri and Keith, their love at first sight when they're just in 7th grade and they're each other's first kisses, but they go out, they have their own lives, and they find each other again. Then Keith, just like Nick, comes home on the day of the disappearance, sees some signs that raise some red flags, but isn't immediately sure what's going on. Cops notice the red flags in the crime scene immediately. The media storm that ensues, understanding the way that America specifically reacts to women who look the way that Sherri did in true crime cases, understanding the way the media would villainize Keith, getting to have that moment of being there to exonerate Keith, trying to re-enter the scene in like a way that is so unrealistic. Like in Gone Girl, the biggest critique is that Amy would have never gotten away with it, but it's a fiction novel, so in that world it's allowed to slide. But in the real world, it doesn't work that way. So Amy coming back covered in blood, like, oh my God, with a dramatic re-entrance, and then the cops just kind of letting her have this because she's a victim. That's not what would happen in real life. And it's clear that Sherri thought that's what would happen by like showing up covered in chains, being like, I need to get back to my family. You know, it just all reeks of like privilege, honestly. And not to mention the way that both Amy and Sherri keep tabs on all of their ex-lovers so that they can use them whenever it benefits them. There's just an incredible amount of parallels. Like I could make my own video just about the parallels, but I don't want this video to be too long. But let me know what you guys think about this case. I actually had like a lot of fun researching it, because although Sherri is a terrible person who most certainly hurt people and did really heinous things, for me, a Spooky Saturday case where like nobody dies and it's more of like a fraudulent situation and somebody just being a terrible person is so much less stressful. So like it was a little bit of like a mental break for me. But we'll be back to the really heavy cases soon, just because you know, they're important stories to tell as well. But for me, this was like a little bit of a mental break. And if you liked this video, Don't forget to follow me on TikTok. I have 2 TikTok accounts. I have Daisy Foko, which is my main, and then I have Daily Foko, which is my lifestyle. Then Instagram, I basically treat as a catch-all. It's got all of my content from every platform, really, just kind of smushed together with my personal life and stuff. So if you just want to know like every side of what I'm doing, that's like the easiest place to see that. But thank you guys so much. If you made it to the end, I really appreciate it. If you're not subscribed already, you know what to do. And I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Bye.